Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Illinois Green Party series. I'm your host, David Rych, with a recurring guest here, Larry Spivak. Spivak?
Spivak is
Spivak? Okay. Who was the president of the Illinois Labor History Society.
still am.
Still am. Okay, still are. Sorry. So very cool. And so we're very fortuitously and not so coincidentally having him on Labor Day. So happy Labor Day to everybody. The labor movement in America and elsewhere across the world has a very long and prestigious history, and it is pervaded with all sorts of ups and downs. And I don't think a lot of people realize that where we're at now, in large part, as far as jobs and benefits and so on, and 40-hour work weeks and labor laws, child labor laws, and so on, comes from the labor movement. And the importance of unions in a large way in the American economy. So here to talk about that and more is Mr. Larry, sir. So why don't you go ahead and kind of kick off and tell us about the Labor History Society, what it is, and your position in it.
Well, I'm president of the Illinois Labor History Society and have served in that capacity since 2006. The society was formed in 1969 when a group of activists, trade unionists in particular, and social justice warriors, or people who were involved in the intersection of those various movements, got together to celebrate May 1st, May Day, and in the spot where the Haymarket Affair took place, or across the street from it at that time. And part of it was that the bombing of the police statue from the Weather Underground at the 1968 Democratic Convention prompted these individuals to say, hey, the story is so poorly told, the story of Haymarket, the story of what it means, the reason that May Day came about. It's so misunderstood, maligned, and there is nothing here in Haymarket Square to represent that most important world event, one of the most important world events, certainly affecting labor and politics in many ways. And so the idea was to promote the story of Haymarket and, of course, labor history in general, Illinois labor history in particular. And as a result of many years of advocacy, in 2004, the city of Chicago, through money from primarily the state of Illinois, erected a public statue, I say a public statue. It was it's the city, so it's the people's statue, so to speak, and it was dedicated in to September of 2004, and the Labor History Society, who played a major role. We're the ones that initiated that whole discussion, and it took 30 years to get something there. If I do the math, 1969 to 2004, it's more than that. It's 35 years. Because there was so much opposition from the establishment. So, but eventually, as the story continued to be told and unfold, and ironically, the Fraternal Order of Police, who were the last opposition to it, their president at that time said, we do collective bargaining. We're part of the labor movement. We're no longer going to oppose this, because it was actually quite surprising. And then the mayor came on board, and so the statue was dedicated in Haymarket Square. But this is a long way of telling who we are. But prior to that, in 1971, the last surviving member of Lucy Parsons' organization, the Pioneer Aid Support Association, Irving Abrams, who was Lucy's lawyer until she died in 1942, but he still dealt with the state issues and was a founding member of the Illinois Labor History Society, deeded the world, I would call it the world's most sacred labor site, which is the Haymarket Martyrs Memorial Monument in Forest Park, Illinois, where the martyrs are laid to rest, or 7 of the 8 are. And so we are the steward of that monument and that property surrounding the iconic monument that perhaps many of your um, members of the Green Party would know about. Hopefully, many of them have seen it. It's a incredible monument, and people from all over the world continue to come all the time to
Yeah.
visit it. So that was really our charge, and then we just grew over the decades in telling the story of labor history, and probably would be, I think it would be fair to argue, we are the country's most prominent labor history association, followed probably by Wisconsin.
Oh wow, that's very well. That's impressive. Very cool. And is this a place? Obviously, it's a place that people can go to. You were talking about how you were there earlier today. It's free day.
Oh, that was the Chicago History Museum where I
Oh, I'm
was.
sorry. That was your
Yeah,
earlier.
yeah,
You said
yeah,
that. Talking about the Polish
right.
people in Chicago. But okay, still, it's the labor history one is something people can go to and visit.
Yeah. Obviously at Forest Park and Haymarket Square, where the events unfolded in 1886, that gave rise to ultimate martyrdom, and what probably many of you viewers may not viewers, listeners, participants, activists may not know is that May 1st, that's celebrated everywhere in the world, but not much in the United States, is because of the events of Haymarket and to celebrate the martyrs, the Chicago martyrs. And so in 1889, delegations met across the world in Paris, France, including those from the United States and Chicago, and declared that May 1st, every year thereafter, should be celebrated as International Labor Day, also called May Day, and in honor of the Haymarket martyrs. And so, unlike, like I should say, like many people of my age, which is I'm a middle baby boomer. I was a little kid during the Cold War, and I would see the news, and I would see the Russian tanks going through Red Square because the news would always show every May Day what was happening in Russia, and then in China because they had parades. Now, little did I know that there were parades in all the European and the countries
Mhm.
everywhere in the world, but we were focused so heavily on the Soviets being our enemy that I grew up afraid of what May Day was. I thought it was the Russian holiday,
Mhm.
and I'm a little kid and I'm watching the news, and there's talk of nuclear war. It's right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, uh, and so it wasn't until I actually got to college that I began to actually learn the real history, and then of course I came to realize that hey, we're celebrating people in the United States in Chicago, even though 6 of the 8 were foreign born. It was uh, quite a revelation to know that this is our history, not Russian history.
Yeah, no, I that makes sense to me. I remember vaguely things. I think I'm just a little bit younger than you, but not much. But I remember that sort of association with May Day, that it was just sort of like some commie pinko holiday, that our enemies across the China and Russia celebrated. And then I remember finding out that about the Haymarket affair, what happened, and that May 1st is like International May Day because of that, and that
Yeah,
America pushed it off to first Monday in September for
right.
completely arbitrary reasons, or just to sort of guard
Well,
themselves against
actually, I'll talk about that.
Go
It
ahead,
wasn't
please.
arbitrary. If I so,
Yeah.
and this has been a more and more of its stories being told about why it's the first Monday in September, and uh, we just celebrated Labor Day this Saturday, 2 days before Labor Day in Pullman, which is now Pullman National Historical Park. It's a national park, Pullman, the south side of Chicago, 111 and Cottage Grove, the factory, and all, which is where the National Park Visitor Center is, but the whole surrounding area is part and parcel of this history. The Chicago Federation of Labor decided to have a Labor Day parade this year there, and so that's where it was held. And uh, the story that people are beginning to learn about is that because a couple things, the national boycott of the Pullman trains, the national strike was taking place in the late spring, summer of 1894, after Pullman had cut the wages of the workers 25 to 60%, and refused to talk to the workers. They called a strike, and eventually the American Railway Workers Union, led by the great Eugene Debs, uh, agreed to support it and called for a national boycott of any railroad car pulling a Pullman car. And until the U.S. government got involved and turned it on its head and it began attaching U.S. mail cars to the Pullman cars, suddenly the American Railway Workers Union was accused of illegal strike. And of course, there was no collective bargaining laws or legislation. Strikes were basically always considered illegal. And but this was the ability to use antitrust law against the union, and the government jailed all the union leaders, and the strike collapsed. But it changed the course of history. But right at that time, uh, U.S. Congress and then the president passed and signed legislation calling for the first Monday in September to be Labor Day. There had been a concern among the elite, the privileged, the corporate agenda, whatever you want to call it, the capitalist class, about the workers were very much celebrating May Day. Although there had been a call for a Labor Day, an official holiday, this was appeasement of sorts to the workers, to the working class, by creating the Labor Day. Although the first Labor Day parade was actually in 1882, there was no official holiday. So it was in response to the National Pullman strike, because there was, in which, of course, and May Day, of course, was the national strike for the 8-hour day. So these were compelling arguments to those in power to do something to try to quell or quash the movement of militancy of workers in this country.
Yeah, wow, that's and doesn't that tie it? What was the eight security guard agency, Pinkerton or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
Pinker?
Yeah, there were others, but Pinkertons are the most infamous, and part and parcel of the whole attack on workers whenever there were strikes.
Can you elaborate on that a bit? Because I think this is important to know, like how violent it got.
Well, actually, it had been violent and culminated. Really, you have to go back a few years. I don't actually remember exactly the development of the Pinkertons, but what one has to we can understand about, in some ways, the militarization of police,
Yep.
law enforcement. Let me call it law enforcement. Goes back to a movement of the very wealthy to protect themselves from their fear that workers would take over the country, to fight immigrants, and to fight the unionists. That was the primary. You could look at cities and you look at the development of police forces, and that was kind of their role back then in I would call it the middle 1800s, middle of the 19th century, and maybe even prior to that. But the issue of immigration and labor unrest, those were really driving forces for creating municipal law enforcement agencies, police departments. The other thing, of course, is that you have events like the 1877 National Railroad Strike, where probably the closest thing this country ever saw to a workers' revolution.
Ooh.
And that caused alarm among the George Pullmans and the Carnegies and the Swifts and the Marshall Fields and those kinds of people, all the the gilded class of that developing Gilded Age, to defend themselves in their mansion. So National Guards are created. We have armories that are still standing. They're not used much anymore, but around the city of Chicago, specifically to make sure that there would be an ability to go after workers on strike, basically, and to defend the rich. The Pinkertons were used in the same capacity, and not just to protect, uh, watching old westerns, and protecting the wagons carrying money across the country, but also to were involved heavily is militia against workers, and this came up in 1877 and thereafter. So um, I that's part of the history of Pinkertons, and the Pinkertons also were married to into the families of other wealthy people, and so that created that relationship.
Yeah, okay, that's very, very interesting stuff. Yeah, I mean, the history of the labor movement is as tumultuous and awful as it became at too many times. I mean, it's extremely fascinating to learn about it. I mean, it's not a dull read at all by any stretch. I mean, and again, how it led to where we're at now, and we still have a long ways to go because unions aren't taken nearly as seriously nowadays as they were back in, say, maybe the right before the middle of 1900s. There was a decline somehow after World War II in their reception and people advocating for them. And they played a big part in doing stuff for the war efforts and stuff like that too. So, but yeah, we don't for some reason it's declined down to like 10% maybe when it was more like at like what 40, 35, 40% back
Uh,
then.
the high point of the density, we can call it the density of the workforce who was eligible to be in unions, was about 35%
35.
from the mid 1950s into the early 60s, but that continued to decline. Yeah, and primarily because workers just weren't being organized as the workforce continued to expand. Initially, that's why you saw the numbers drop. Today, the number is just under 12%, somewhere between 11 and 12. But what brings the number, what's really alarming is that if you factor out the 35 to 40% of public sector workers who are organized, the private sector is only about 6%.
Oh
So,
wow. Yeah, I didn't even think about that.
yeah.
That's true.
So if you're an optimist, there's a huge number of people who could be organized, and of course, we're seeing, the last couple of years, a new profound interest,
Yeah.
not just among, first of all, among workers who wish they could have a union. They say wish because so many workers have no concept or idea of how you organize into a union. And unions, of course, labor laws are so backward in the United States, it's hard for unions to succeed in that environment. But there's been an upsurge. Something like 60,000 people joined, organized last year,
Hmm.
this last year, or I think over the last 12 months. So I'm not quite sure what the time period was. But yeah, the numbers have drastically declined. It's much higher in Illinois, of course, and in most of the blue states. But even so, when I got involved in the labor movement in the early 1980s, I think the number in Illinois was like 22%, and it's probably now, maybe 14%. I'm not exactly sure what the number is, but maybe 16%.
Wow. Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, you're hearing a lot over the last, couple of years, and now, like, it's about Starbucks, Amazon facilities, unionizing stuff like that. I know that was a UAW. Is that right? Are they right? That's about ready to go on strike now.
United Auto Workers.
Is
Yeah,
that
they've authorized, their members have authorized them to call a strike if they choose to. So,
like? And of course, we had the last one with the rail, so the railroad something or something within that,
yeah.
where Biden, Mr. Pro Union, got in and pretty much did nothing. But then they ended that the before they resolved the contract, but I guess it wasn't a very good one as far as I remember.
Well,
Um,
with their primary issue of getting time off is kind of interesting, actually, because because it was an arbitration decision, effectively an arbitration decision, as opposed to letting the union negotiate the terms. The government intervened to stop the possibility of a strike because they could do that with railway and airlines. And But now most of the railways have been granting subsequent to that negotiations more time off because it's such
They're
a
afraid. Yeah.
yeah. So that's which I mean that's the result of the activism of the union members and the rank and file.
Yeah, no, that's. I mean, if it worked out, in effect and residual effect, that's great. But I mean, there's still something about like, I mean, I've heard people say, and I don't necessarily disagree that like one of the worst things for the labor movement was the government getting involved. I
Well, yeah,
mean,
uh, it, it's a mix. It's a complicated issue,
right?
but
No, I understand
but
that.
but certainly that's the case. I think that there are some people who felt that there never should have been a National Labor Relations Act. I don't agree
Right.
with that because
Okay.
that's the Magna Carta for labor in so many ways. But and what we saw after the uh, um, uh, 1935 Act creating what the National Labor Relations Act was the millions and millions of workers who flocked to unions that transformed America into, we'll use the term that we all use in America, middle class.
Mm,
Working class became very working middle class as
mm,
we don't use working class so much in this country. We
right.
don't think in terms, everybody's middle class in our,
Right.
but uh, of course, many people have now dropped out of the so-called middle class because of the decline of unionization. So
Right.
the relationship is it's incontrovertible.
Yeah. Um, what do you think the government could do better as far as approaching it? Like when it comes into arbitration, because that's like this legal defense and a legal decision can say, okay, so now this is what we're saying is going to happen, and that's it. That's all there is to it. I mean, do you think the workers should be like, well, too bad, we're going on strike anyway? And if they did, what would happen?
Oh, those are questions that we don't really know because um, uh, so often much is governed by uh, the rules of the road, so to speak. Collective bargaining laws. I think there's an important place for collective bargaining laws and legislation and workers' rights. But it was actually up to 1947 when Taft-Hartley was passed. There was a lot of leeway for unions that would strike for recognition. And when unions struck for recognition, they were much tended to be, in one, they tended to be stronger because to strike meant that you had grassroots involvement, rank and file involvement, buy-in it from the workers in whatever industry or company that was. And uh, under as the law developed, labor law developed post, especially after the 1940s, it became so legalized that it was it became more of a bureaucratic type of movement, and so that in some ways one could argue takes power out of workers' hands. But again, it's complicated because on the other hand, having a meaningful way to express oneself by, say, a majority of workers, for instance, under current law. Um, Typically what happens is when there's a majority, when a union gets a majority interest or a strong majority interest showing, they file a petition before the labor board. It's both, especially in the private sector in particular. It's different in public sector because public sector is governed by state and local legislation, ordinances, et cetera. But National Labor Relations Act is for all private sector workers who are deemed to be eligible to be unionized. And uh, the idea that you just simply, you get a number of people to sign a card and then you file it sometimes doesn't create the organic buy-in to what you need to be. And so, in that sense, sometimes this bureaucratic mechanism, legalistic expression of labor rights uh, doesn't everything being governed by we all want the rule of law, but the rule of law tends to still support the employer in much stronger ways. And so um, It's these are good questions, and hence this is why, especially in the early 2000s, as unions could not win elections because the delays. So let's say you worked at a company. I mean, we see it today. The company will spend millions of dollars and delay the election, and of course, the company has the right to uh, have complete control over the workers. And while they say they're not violating the law, they do, but that's not enforced because of the weak labor laws and the not very good labor boards that have existed since on and off over that period of time. Um, by the time you have a union election, workers have turned over, or they've had the company's done all these captive audience meetings and threatened workers over and over again so that they're afraid. So if you work at a Starbucks, turnover is huge, right? And so if you delay an election for 2 years or 3 years, those same people aren't going to be working there. And it's not just a Starbucks, that's just an example. But so this is one of the main reasons that there's been efforts to create new labor law that would stop that from happening. So in that sense, if you had labor law that provided for quick, fast recognition if a majority of workers sought interest, which of course is the law for public sector workers in Illinois, which is one reason we're so successful in organizing public sector workers in Illinois and a lot of other places, because you just have to show a majority interest and you're recognized. That's it. You don't have to go through a 4-year process and spend money you don't have to defend rights you should have had. And
Right.
so it's stacked. So, in other words, the law is stacked against workers in this country to unionize, which is a big reason why you've seen the decline of
Right.
workers represented, especially in traditional industries that have been offshored, and the loss of manufacturing, which was densely unionized for decades. And we don't make things anymore. We distribute things and we sell things. And so those are the industries where people are heavily unrepresented.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and it's unfortunate. It's reminded me a lot of like obviously this is a third party talk show, and a lot of the struggles that third parties go through, whether it be
Sure.
us or libertarians or whatever,
Yeah.
Constitution Party, because the laws are so stacked against us. For
Yeah.
example, here in the like if you wanted to run for federal House representative as a third party member in Illinois, you have to get over 20,000 signatures. If you're
Right.
a Democrat or Republican, it's under 1,000. I mean, it's
Yes.
ridiculous.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, and no rational person could look at that and say, "Oh, that makes sense." I mean, it's just utterly just
Right. Hey,
buffoonery.
listen, I agree with that. I mean, as in the current world, most of the liberal-minded people
Mhm.
probably vote Democratic,
Right.
and that sort of thing. And I know people who are part of the instrument of the Democratic Party, and they would support those things because the fear of third parties disrupting
Mhm,
candidates
mhm, mhm.
getting elected. But yeah, you're absolutely right about that. It's um, very difficult for our non-parliamentary system of government to get representation, right?
But it's because I mean I don't know if it's a system itself. It's just the ruling duopoly just has all the control, and so they
Well, yes,
they
right,
protect it
right. And
through
in the
laws.
case
Which
of
I mean, but in party suppression is voter suppression. I don't think they realize that.
Right. And in the case of workers, it's a monopoly of one, which is the employer's advocates basically run the show. So
Right.
it's,
Right.
and that goes back to the issue of, as you think about, there's been talk, as I mentioned, there was a lot of organizing took place outside of labor law since the early 2000s, where workers basically would just force companies to recognize them through the potential of a strike. Instead of filing cards for an election, they just
Mhm,
simply went right to the company, and with the rank and file support, were
mhm,
able to
mhm.
get recognition, which is what was happening in the 1930s and 40s into the really. So
Yeah. 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 Interesting stuff. Well, I'm excited to see what's going to happen with the UAW and more of the Amazon and Starbucks and people like that, because it looks like there's some fire there and some momentum going on,
Yeah,
which I think is healthy.
I don't know the terms, but the 320,000 UPS workers just settled their contract. They had authorized a strike, and that
Yes.
put a fear in the heart of UPS. So, but hey, if you can get a good settlement, you want a good. I mean, that's the best possible world is if you can, if your members deem it to be a good settlement, then that's great. So
Right. No, absolutely, absolutely.
yeah,
But that's the point, though, is that the laborers are kind of like the final authority on what is concerned the policies concerning their behavior and benefits and so on at the workplace. I mean, one of the greatest statements I've ever heard concerning unionism is all about like bringing democracy to the workplace. Is that so?
exactly. Yeah, a
That's I
voice,
mean,
all the
pretty
voice in the job, right?
right. There's a power structure there, and there needs to be some sort of checks and balances involved, and that's all. It's not really that complicated. I mean, in details, specific situations, it can become complicated, but the general notion of a union isn't that difficult to understand. And I don't understand why most people don't buy into it more so. Like, why would you not want to have a say in the policies that are made concerning your your like? Why would you not? Why would you just want to? Does somebody have their own will just wail on yours?
Well, it's you grow up, you're raised in a paternalistic society, and I'm using paternalistic in the in terms of employers, and I
Hmm.
mean it goes way back to George Pullman was the best example of a paternalistic employer, but people they rule by fear or
Hmm.
through fear, and workers are afraid. They're afraid. They're because of instability, because
That is true.
we don't have social legislation protecting workers and citizens like that, which exist in Europe and other developed countries. Let me put it that way.
Right.
And so you're like worried about, well, I'll lose my job, even though it's supposedly illegal to fire a worker for forming a union. It happened
But they just find another set of reasons. So they
yeah,
make up other reasons.
right.
You know.
10,000 workers a year are known, it's estimated, are fired each year for trying to organize a union, which is
Wow.
illegal, but it's the way it is. So multiply that year after year after year, and people, you know, are afraid. I've worked in the labor movement almost my entire adult life, and first as a teacher and being a vice president of my local union to going to work for AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, and I saw it all the time, the fear of workers, and that was in the public sector, which isn't where it's generally a safer place to organize because in a blue state, in particular, civil service and everything else, um, uh, it's not as a desperate situation in terms of a lack of stability.
Yeah, I was a member of an ASME union out in Portland, Oregon, at Oregon Health and State University. I
Uh-huh.
worked in the food and beverage part of it while I was going to college, and I became a union steward. And what a wonderful experience it was, and it was very cool. But I will say, just to follow up on what you were just saying, I think another kind of obstacle to people understanding and advocating for unions is a lot of union stuff with the contract negotiations stuff so on. Like, I know, like, the people that I worked with, they didn't see that happening. Sure, they got memos and stuff which most people ignored and didn't read.
Right,
And then all of a sudden a contract is decided and nobody knows what that means or
right.
what it says, and they don't see any really substantial difference in their whatevers. And so they're like, oh, unions are useless, and that kind of thing. I'm like, no, I don't think you understand exactly what just happened, how much work it took, and what protections you got and benefits you got from it. I understand you're not seeing it, but that's kind of on you because you're really not looking for it.
Yeah,
But that still becomes a perceived obstacle, if that makes sense.
yeah. It's yeah. It's hey, listen, how do you explain the millions of poor white people in the South? I use that as an example. It's not just the South, it's white people everywhere who vote against their own
Oh,
self-interest,
it's
economic
crazy because right.
self-interest, and remain in poverty because they're going to vote for the party that doesn't represent them at all.
Right.
But they, whether it's because of a single issue or unfortunately racism or things like that,
Right.
people can't make that connection apparently. And hey, I know people who are known a couple people whose um, they were married to teacher and they benefited from their spouse's pension, but they were like they would speak against the problem of pensions. For
Right.
nobody has a pension, why should they have a pension? They
Right.
say,
Right.
well, your wife has a pension. Well, that's different. You know.
Yeah, no, it's unfortunate.
Yeah,
It's a huge obstacle. But gotta just keep trying to enlighten and educate. That's why I have people like you on the show. Well, let's talk about unions themselves and some of the particular things that happen within that sort of dynamic. Because, like I said, I was a union steward, and it was extremely cool experience. I learned a lot about a lot of different things. First of all, just like how cool it was to be able to sit across the table from like my manager and like, you
well, there
know,
you go. That's democracy. That's what we're
exactly what
talking
it is.
about,
And at
right?
that table, we were
Right.
equals, and then, like, and even though like I was his outside of that office or whatever, I was his employee, that kind of thing. And there were rules against retribution and so on and so forth. And so it created definitely some very awkward social situations between
Yeah.
myself and my managers, people who managers who I like got along with very, very famously, but then I sat down, I'm like, no, you can't do that, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
So it definitely affected the social dynamic, but you know what? I don't care. I had plenty of friends. So, but it was just a really cool experience, very lawyerly in a lot of ways. And I was getting a philosophy degree at the time, so I knew how to argue. I knew how to put arguments together and stuff like that. So I did a pretty good job at it. I really enjoyed doing it, and just representing the members and bringing information again from the union to the member populace and telling them what was going on. I did that a lot because, like I said, I noticed that sort of
Hmm.
that gap between the two people, the two parties there, if you will. So it was a very enjoyable experience. But one of the things I remember, and this came up recently because I actually had Spike Cohen, who was the recent Libertarian Party's vice presidential candidate. And I love Spike. And there's a big part of me that's libertarian in the sense that I believe in individual rights and freedoms and so on and so forth. In fact, I sort of tie that into unionism, is that each individual has a right to these wonderful things. It's
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
exactly, you can't be very happy if your employer is just wailing on you all the time or depriving you of your needs. But like he brought up the idea of like volunteer unions and that kind of thing. And I don't have any numbers on like what unions in this country are like, if you get this job, you're a union member, that's it. Or if you get this job, you're allowed to be or not allowed to be, or allowed not to be. I don't know. I know that in the OHSU where I worked, you didn't have to join the union per se, but you still had to pay dues every month because the only thing you couldn't do, the only benefit you or safety you didn't have is you couldn't vote. You still
Right.
got the same benefits, the same
Right.
wages that were all negotiated in the contract. So I thought about that. I want to hear what you have to think about this. But so let me give me my spiel first. I thought about it. I was saying to another friend of mine who's a libertarian, I'm like, I'm not opposed to it being voluntary. I mean, I don't want to force anybody to do anything. But let's take like butchers' unions, for example. Let's say you get a job at a butcher's shop and the butcher's union just concluded negotiating a contract and you decide not to join the union but still be employed there. Okay, well, you don't get any of the benefits or protocols or safeties, precautions from the union contract. You don't get to do any of that. So, like, for example, part of the negotiation was this new meat slicer that we have that has all these upgraded safety measures and methods and things and stuff like that. You don't get to use that. So if you don't want to be a part of the union, you have to get your own stuff like that. So then all of a sudden it becomes this kind of ridiculous not to join the union because my motto for that is like, if you want to do everything for yourself, then go do everything by yourself.
Yeah, well, uh, well, so for this is a question that goes to the heart of the ability of employers to divide and conquer. Because so in the public sector, there is no compulsory union membership. It's not a closed shop, a union shop. That means different things based on where you're at. But in the public sector, uh, but this is, of course, there was a Supreme Court decision in Illinois called the Janus decision, which gutted, in some ways, the right of the union to collect fair share fees. In the public sector, it's called fair share fees, which is you don't have to be a member, but you still have to pay the cost of uh, collective bargaining, which is it's a mathematical formula that comes up, and it could vary from 75 to 95% of the dues for the cost of representation. Because you're in the unit, you benefit from it, you get this, the union negotiates for you. But if you don't want to be a member and be a voting member and go to union meetings or vote for officers or policy, that's fine. Don't. That's what fair share is. Um, in the private sector, there are places where you go to work at, uh, as an iron worker, you belong to the union, like it or not, which is important, which is good. You don't want to go to a meeting, don't go to a meeting. It's funny because the company, the right wing turned this, that's why you have all these organizations to try to gut unions by ending, they call it the right to work, right? The right to work state. Oh, you want to have a union, but nobody has to be a member, nobody has to pay dues. And so, how many people would say, hey, I get those benefits and I don't have to pay, I'm not going to.
Right.
And so, like every week now in Illinois, the Freedom Foundation, the National Right to Work Committee, the American Legislative Exchange Commission all work together to send out mailers to state employees saying, save this amount of money every year, drop the union, being a member. And, of course, they still would get all the benefits. It hasn't had a whole lot of success in Illinois, but it has had some success in some parts of the country. Um, and so this is just simply divide and conquer mechanisms. If I live where I live in Oak Park, Illinois.
Yeah.
I, I don't have kids in the schools. I pay really high taxes to support one of the best school systems in our great park districts. If I do use the library, I do use the park, but I don't have kids in the school system. And I'm paying primarily our property taxes here go for that. I'm willing to do it because it benefits the community. It's good for the community. And so, can I opt out of paying my taxes? Well, because I can't even do, some people do that, because they don't like the military budget, but you, most people don't do it. Some people have gone to jail over it, but, we all have we have to participate in our community or whatever the legislation or law is regarding paying taxes and fees. So we do, but when it comes to workers, the corporate agenda is to say, no, no, this is America. It's free to choose what you want. Who has that choice except the rich and the famous? So, which ironically, the rich and famous are all union members. If you look at
Yeah.
who
Well,
are
like in
union,
Hollywood. Yeah.
yeah, well, Hollywood, every major sport.
Major
They
sport. Yeah.
not only do they have union representation, not only do they have agents, they have unions, right? Why is it that the most talented people, and this goes counter to the argument that unions are about letting mediocrity rise to the
Right.
top? If you are the most talented people ever are TV, television, movie, music personalities. Most major orchestras are unionized. Who's more talented than the cream of the crop in sports at the professional level? They're
Mhm.
all unionized. Why do they
Mhm.
want a union? Because they understand that collective association gives them that collective power gives them even more. And that's the thing that the myth that the unions are bad for professionalism. It's a joke, that people buy into it. All they have to do is look around and see. And now I think that is happening because there is this recognition, I think, among the working class that other people have something and they're getting it from unions, but because they're denied the right to have a union through the legal processes and through illegal actions of employers, they just simply don't do it.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's yeah, no, absolutely. And I
Yeah.
know that you don't see a lot of unions in like white collar type companies like investment firms and stuff like that. I mean, they're probably almost unheard of. I can't even think of one unless you know some.
Well, yeah, at that level, but there was a time when people at all kinds of levels were organized, but in particular, like you have people have associations, which are basically, unions, even if they're not doing collective bargaining. What's the American Medical Association but a union? What's the American Bar Association but a union? Because they do advocacy, representation in many levels. They may not bargain wages or specific, but medical associations have a lot of power. That's what a union is. It's
Right.
simply an advocacy organization made up of people who representing those others. And so, insurance agents had some unionization around the country. I don't know if they still do some in some of the companies, but so and of course in company, in public sector, the highest levels of advanced degree people and are unionized. So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I know that obviously in the public college, universities and stuff like that, they're all unionized. What about private ones? Is Harvard unionized?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Princeton, Yale, all those guys.
yeah. Well, not I don't know about the faculty at a place like Harvard, although that many of them would probably belong to the American Association of University Professors, which in some places is part and parcel of they work, and do collective bargaining. But yeah, when you said Harvard, certainly all the non-faculty are
Right.
uh, represented now, and we're seeing the graduate students all across the country organizing, um, where although there's always in the private universities, and there's been mixed not legislation, but supreme, court decisions about that. So, but
Okay. So we don't have a lot of this. Has flew by. That means I
yeah,
had a great time listening. Um, how would one try like even begin to form their own union? Like they're at a workplace, they're like, "This sucks. We need a union." What do they do?
well, I mean, let's make something up. Let's say
Okay.
that you work at the uh, Ralph's supermarket that's not unionized, like many in the Chicago area in particular. A lot of grocery store workers are unionized, but a lot of them aren't. And probably a good example would be like, I don't know if they have an organizing drive at Pete's Fresh Grocery, but Pete's continues to build new stores and more stores and more stores. And, well, we need a union. Well, the union that tends to represent the grocery store workers is the United Food and Commercial Workers. So you would call them and say, hey, we'd be interested in organizing a union at this store. And a union organizer would probably come out and talk to them. But of course, it requires people to not be afraid. Well, you can't require people to not be afraid, but to have the courage to uh, organize. And that's usually about creating a committee in the workplace where people can then have access to talk to each other, because union organizers can't go into a workplace and just walk around. The laws have basically stopped that, the court decisions, which is, well, in fact, it's kind of interesting. Retail, like Walmart, stopped allowing, I don't know if they still do, but they stopped allowing Salvation Army to be there because the court said, well, if others can be outside your store, then a union should be able to flyer and leaflet. And so they didn't want to have the precedent, so they stopped
Oh
letting the
wow,
Salvation Army
interesting.
collect at
Yeah.
Walmart, because there had been talk about, Walmart was the largest private employer in this country, I think up until a couple of years ago, with like 1.3 million employees. And but Walmart, a little off subject here, but Walmart closed stores where they tried to organize.
Hmm.
Walmart shut down. It's actually, you talked about butchers. They
Hmm.
stopped having butchers in their stores because butchers in Texas organized a union, so they stopped having butchers anywhere. Because um, you can see what companies will do to avert having a
Yeah.
union. But yeah, going back to your question, there, you could go to the, if you're in Illinois, you could call the Illinois AFL-CIO and say, hey, we're trying to think about a union, and you hopefully would get some references to what union might be interested in organizing that workforce if there was a serious interest. And even if it wasn't, even if some people expressed an interest. So that's basically what it is, contact a union, and you can do that through a labor organization. Look up the AFL, or if you live in um, Bloomington, Illinois, you might contact the Bloomington Area Federation of Labor. So that's the easy, the, or
So
call me,
basically, whatever
call
industry,
me, and I'll direct you to
call
somebody.
Larry Spivak. So whatever industry you work in, like you sort of just kind of go and find the union that represents that. Generally speaking, make contact and say, "Hey, we're thinking about doing this."
That's a good way to do it. There are some people, one of the things, and I would say this is a problem of the labor movement in America because it goes way back to the 19th century, is that, you still have employers with multiple unions representing workers. To me, that's not the strongest approach, but it's what's developed. And so, you could call a union that's not the main union of that organization, because
Mm.
steel workers do represent people in retail. Steel workers actually represent pharmacists in Illinois. So, you know,
Okay, that's a
so
twist.
yeah, I mean, it's just how there was a period, especially in the private sector, where private sector workers, they were like, you, uh, unions were, some unions would just, if there was an opportunity to organize somebody, since they had lost so many members, they'd go and organize them. So,
Interesting, interesting. Okay, and like AFSCME and AFL-CIO, UAW. Um,
by the way, I don't know how many of I keep calling them viewers. I guess
Yours
today
is
it's
fine.
viewers,
Yours work.
but members know that AFSCME in Illinois has been organizing all the cultural workers in Chicago. The Field Museum, the Art Institute got their first contract. Three groups at the Art Institute, the Field Museum, the Newberry Library. I'm missing one, but so after the Art Institute organized other museums, this is another thing. If you organize one place, sometimes other people hear about it, and that's how it gets the ball rolling.
Oh, that's very interesting. That's very cool. Yeah. So I mean, I would encourage people who feel like their workplace is it could use a union to help it out, to reach out to your respective union people. We probably just Google it, like I work in this industry, what union represents it, and poof, it'll happen right there. Which is very cool. What about agriculture? I mean, because a lot of it is like family farms and stuff like that, but you have like mass like Monsanto. Oh God, they're so disgusting. But like I can't imagine they're unionized, and if they are, they're
Well, probably their factories probably are.
okay.
Probably what used to be, I forget now, I can't remember the mergers, but good chance that most Monsanto
Okay.
plants are organized, I would bet, because that goes back to uh, the the union. They've merged over the years, and it's no longer the same union. But I can't even remember now who represents chemical
Oh.
workers. You mentioned agriculture, so I didn't know if you were talking. I thought you were going to talk about farming, but that's different.
Yeah, no, 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 no. I mean, you could talk about that real quick too, but no,
Mhm.
I went to Monsanto because I just realized that it's such a big company when it comes to
Yeah,
like, but they're more about pesticides and fertilizers and stuff like that instead of like
yeah,
direct farming. They're still evil, but I mean,
yeah. You know,
so
if they have a factory in New Jersey, it's probably unionized. If it's in Texas, it may not be.
okay.
So,
But what are like about the big like commercial company farmers, people who grow tomatoes for McDonald's?
yeah.
Do you know
Well, I mean,
anything?
yeah, the United Farm Workers, which if we all know of Cesar Chavez, and hopefully
Oh
will
yeah. Oh,
Doris Huerta. By the way, the United Farm Workers, Cesar Chavez's son, spoke at our May Day rally at Haymarket Square this year because they dedicated a plaque to the Haymarket Monument in Haymarket Square, which is what we do every year. Is we get a labor, usually an international or a labor organization from another country, but we have a few from domestically, and the AFL-CIO, Chicago Federation of Labor, and the United Farm Workers dedicated a plaque this year, and Paul Chavez, the son of Caesar, spoke. And, you know, the United Farm Workers formed in the 1960s because they talk about unfairness, lack of dignity, and right now the United Farm Workers have been advocating for legislation because of the climate change that goes to the heart of the Green Party, and the ever increasing extremes of temperature, especially heat, and the sickness and deaths that have ensued in agriculture. You know, it's but you know, the law in so the United Farm Workers have had some success in Florida and in Ohio among tomato pickers. There was a boycott for a long time of Taco Bell because of the tomatoes that they were using, and but again, I don't know how it's all played out, but yeah, the United Farm Workers would be the primary union representing those.
I'm gonna have to reach out to them and see if there's like a local people here or something like that, or even obviously all through camera. I would love to interview some of that, but like you said, like you know, labor and agriculture would be a wonderful interview. And do you know Paul Chavez? I mean, can you connect?
Well, I met him at the May Day rally.
You don't have a cell number or anything like that?
I think he gave me a card, and I'll look it up.
Look, I'm gonna hit you up on that.
Listen, hit me up. I can get you in touch with them.
That would be fantastic. I love that. Thank you so much. Yeah, I could talk about labor and agriculture and this kind of stuff all the time. One of the reasons on a personal level why I love doing this show is I learn so much from people such as yourselves about topics and issues that are extremely important. Not just to myself, but obviously the Green Party and most people. There seems to be a raising of consciousness concerning a lot of these things, especially agriculture, because of climate change. I mean, it's looking bad, you know, with all the flooding and the heat waves and everything. This is all unprecedented. This year was the hottest year on record, like as far as we know. July was the hottest month on record, as far as we know. El Nino is kicking the crap out of like everywhere. And there are still deniers out there. I'm like, you're out of your mind. But okay, you know, I mean, it's just so bad. And I know people who are Republicans who are like, you know, they're so frustrated that nobody's doing. They want to see their children grow up and be healthy in a healthy world. And they can see this happening too. I'm like, well, then stop voting Republican. You know,
I watched a part of the Republican debate. I was at a week or two ago, and it was really interesting because they had a young person ask a question, not in the audience, but they did it from some other area, you know, streamed to the candidates. And he said, as a young person, what would you like to do about climate? What are you going to do for us who care about climate change? Because it's going to affect our lives in the future and so on. And so I was actually quite amazed that there was even a question on that, to that panel, of which mostly they all tried to deny it, but in any event, it was quite fascinating to me that
that question even made its way into that arena.
Yeah,
you know, that at least there was one Republican wondering about it. You know, yeah, no, absolutely correct. Yeah, I think that's when I turned it off. As Vivek Ramaswamy, he's like, "Oh, it's all a hoax." I'm like, "All right, that's it. I'm done."
Yeah, right.
You know, I'm tired of hearing that. You know, I mean, how much whatever. We'll talk about climate change another time. So, okay, Larry Spivack, president of Illinois Labor History Society. Thank you so much for coming on again.
Hey, and your viewers, tell them to go to IllinoisLaborHistory.org, and that's our website, and they can check us out, and they can learn about all the things that we're doing and have done, and hopefully we'll see the intersection of these democratic movements of those, and whether it's the Green Party or the labor movement, or telling the story of workers organizing.
Very cool. That's very cool. And I would love to make my way down there and check it out.
Oh, by the way, it's IllinoisLaborHistory.org.
Hold on.
If you just Google Illinois labor history, our name will probably pop up, but it's illinoislaborhistory.org. Yes.
Right, there you go. So that is it. It is correct.
Yes.
Spelling form. But yeah, just Google that and check it out. That'd be very cool. It's it's awesome. I mean, there was a labor history museum in Portland. I lived in Portland for like 12 years, and I went in there, and it was just again a fascinating history. It's very nuanced, and I don't think people realize how much happened there. Like it's an insane amount of stuff. I mean,
the Pacific Northwest Labor History Association is a very dynamic organization.
Oh, Portland's very left. I mean, in a lot of ways. No, it's very, very cool. I actually miss Portland quite a bit. Yeah, very cool. All right, well, we're at an hour, so thank you very much again.
All right,
talk absolutely, to you and I will hit you up for that contact information and have you back on the show another time, future date. Okay.
Take care.
Thank you, Larry. Take care, everybody. Thanks again for tuning into Illinois Green Party Series. I'm your host, David Rych. Until next time, be good, be green.